Professor Larry Sabato, you're listening to Business Daily from the BBC with Ed Butler. So let's take a pause from all of this constitutional debate and Donald Trump's own personal record. Is there a broader system within the US political system that supports corruption, rent-seeking? Some certainly think so, to a dangerous degree. Martin Gillen is a professor of politics at Princeton University. He spent years studying what he says is an unusual mismatch for a democracy. The clear discrepancy between what ordinary American voters want to see and what lawmakers in Washington actually enact.
What I looked at was the relationship between what Americans say they want their government to do and what their government does. And I focused on different groups of Americans, and particularly those with low or middle or high incomes, to see whether the policies that they preferred were reflected in the policies that were adopted over about a 25-year period.
And what did you find?
Well, what I found was that there is a relationship between government policy and public preferences, but only among the well-to-do. So once you take into account what affluent Americans want, the preferences of the middle class or the poor have no influence over the policies that the government adopts.
So the conclusion of this is that it is wealth, not electoral power, in other words, the number of votes, that determine much of political policy making.
That is very well put. That's exactly right.
How do you account for that? Because Americans do vote in elections. They vote in quite a lot of elections every couple of years, and people are getting voted and voted out of office according to their record.
Well, to a degree that is true. People do have choices when they go to the polls, but the only choices they have are those on the ballot in front of them. And in order to run a viable campaign for a national office in the United States, one needs an enormous sum of money. And the only ways to get that money are either to be independently wealthy yourself or to have the backing of wealthy donors.
Do voters simply not notice, then, that their wishes are being ignored?
Well, I think to a degree they do notice. On surveys, it's very clear that Americans believe the government pays little attention to their needs or their preferences. Surveys ask questions like, the government care about what people like you think? And in the 1960s, overwhelming majorities of Americans felt that their government did care about their needs and their preferences, and that's declined over time, so that now only small minorities of Americans agree with that. So people do notice, but again, their choices are limited to those on the ballot, and in order to get on the ballot, takes the backing of a lot of money.
The way that your research has been sold, to me at least, has been in the context of an oligarchy, describing the United States as an oligarchy. Is that too strong a term?
Well, the term oligarchy conjures up the image of a small number of very affluent people who are calling all the shots, and I think it's more complicated than that. It's shifting sets of coalitions among the well-to-do and among interest groups. So I call it a sort of poorly functioning and very unequal democracy.
At what point do we start seriously seeing this being corrected? Because it does seem to me as though inevitably, eventually, in a free society, it's going to be drawn to people's attention.
This isn't the first time in American history where we've faced these kinds of inequalities and lack of responsiveness from government. In many ways, our current situation resembles the situation at the end of the 19th and early beginning of the 20th century, when government was widely perceived as being corrupt and Congress in the pocket of business interests. And it took decades of pushback, organizing by people like the populists and the progressives to make changes. But changes were made, and perhaps as things continue to go in the direction they have been recently, we will see continued organizing, continued resistance, not just against Trump, but against the kinds of inequalities that our government has been perpetuating.
Professor Martin Gillen, who does point